Dear listener, please be advised this podcast contains discussion of sexual assault that may be triggering for some individuals.
Welcome back to the Fox Den. This is Patty Skinner, Director of Library Services.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lundberg-Anders, Professor of Communications.
And this is Sean Henning, Professor of English and Education.
Today we're talking about the final section of Firekeeper's Daughter. The word that came to mind for this last section was complicated. Things did not have a nice, tidy ending that maybe left us feeling dissatisfied or maybe a little conflicted. But I think there's a lot to talk about in the end of this book, and we're going to jump right in. So Donis in this section really has to confront her own version of the truth. She has to start being honest with herself and with others around her, and even explaining to her mom the reason why she left hockey and that she has a medical condition that she never disclosed. So I think the truth is really coming out in this part of the book.
One of the reflections that I had about that particular stage in the book is I was actually surprised that Donis decided to keep the severity of that injury so sheltered, almost protected as a secret. And I couldn't understand why. And then it later made me reflect on how fragile her mother was and how much she felt like she had to protect her mother, not only in the decision for her to stay and attend Lake State, despite, wanting to go to U of M, but then also just in every way that she approached her mother. I felt like she treated her mother almost as though she were some kind of fragile vase. And near the end, it was almost Donis's fragility that, in my mind, led her to treat her mother in a different way and to say, I've got to be honest. So I felt like she kept that hidden as a means of protecting her mother, and she was ready to be more honest with herself, but also with her mother, and maybe even pushing her mother to be stronger. And for those of you that read the second book, no spoilers here, but there are ways that her mother does have to become stronger. Yeah.
Right, that theme of keeping things secret and not being able to speak about them or talk about them. What I'm interested in the end of the book is the way that that's communicated through storytelling. Obviously, Native American traditions, storytelling is such an important part, and that fascinates me because as an Irish American, the power of Irish stories for a culture or a civilization that's been oppressed. It's a really important way to keep things going and alive. So this is the section where that yellow pansy story happens.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key things about that story is that the character that's involved in the story won't share or won't communicate the thing that's troubling her, or this thing that happened to her, and won't share and won't reveal the secret. But the story allows the person listening to the story to think about how to share, how to participate in a community through storytelling. And that's a really old storytelling tradition, right? So Aristotle's notion of catharsis, that people who are participating in a work of art see their own agony reflected in the story and therefore get to release that. So that part of it, right? That's not just that Donis finds difficulty sharing secrets, but that because of her telling the story allows people who also carry burdens or secrets to release those through this storytelling. So I thought that part of this ending was really brilliant.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. What makes me wonder, though, is, the pansies came up earlier in the book too, right? Near the beginning, if I'm not mistaken. And so Donna's looking at them, reflecting on them, not fully understanding the entire significance behind them. And then when she is at the ceremony with more than 100 women, right? And how that number speaks volumes, but then how Granny June talks about Lily was so grateful that you weren't here each and every year. And so I thought, isn't it fascinating too, how that story is sheltered until someone has an experience that forces them to become part of that group. Do you know what I mean? So I agree with you. Like, the storytelling aspect is enormously powerful in so many ways, culturally speaking, and yet at the same time, that story is protected until it is a story that you are a part of in some way, shape, or form. And I think about that even with the blanket experience and how Donis knew some of the basic principles, if you will, of that experience, but how Aunt Teddy totally slammed the door on that and said, I don't want you to be a part of this. I don't want you to know anything about it. And how that's something that came to my mind is that there's this sheltering effect. And yet when you are a part of that, it helps to release you from the pain of those different experiences. And with that, I'd like to relate that to the jingle dress even. So a couple of comments with that. One is I was watching a video of a young woman from Minnesota, from an Ojibwe tribe in Minnesota, and she makes jingle dresses. And she was reflecting back on the inception of the jingle dress, right? And so people talk about that as this healing. It was a part of a dream, and then it becomes a healing ceremony and practice. And it almost completely died out between the boarding schools and some other experiences. And then she talks about how the women brought this ceremony back, but that originally the jingles were tops of the snuff tins.
Wow.
Right? And the shape of them as this cone. So in one article I was reading, it talks about when the dance is happening, it's of course this prayer that's happening alive and this gathering of people and experiences, but it's also meant to sound like rain, which is reflective and it's supposed to help be healing. But this young woman from Minnesota was also talking about that the shape of the jingle brings in, it's meant to gather the pain that that person has experienced. And then as the dance is unfolding, depending on the tempo of the particular dance, it pushes it out. And that helps to release the pain. And so I just thought about not only the story that's surrounding an artifact that comes alive in different ways depending on the music that's happening in the moment, but also of how this particular artifact allows for healing in the end.
Wow, that was beautifully said, Jen. And I love the ceremony and the practice of those rituals and the gathering together and the healing that can bring. It's such a good point and so important to this section of the book.
Yeah, can I pick up on one piece of what Jen said there too?
Of course.
So the thing about the blanket party, because Patty, when you started this whole thing, you were talking about the ways in which the ending may feel unsatisfying to readers.
Yeah.
And then so that's one of those areas where, because we relentlessly over the last part of the book, she keeps continually pointing out to us that some of the people who have committed the most egregious crimes or sins in the story, nothing will happen to them, or we're not sure that anything will happen to them, and there won't be justice. And that, when we first heard about the blanket party, when we're talking about why the aunt protected Donis from participating in that, is because Donis wouldn't necessarily need to have recourse to vigilante justice, because she would have access to more traditional forms of justice. When that shifts on her, the terrible irony of that is, now that she's an enrolled member of the tribe, she therefore has less access to traditional forms of justice. And if that's unsatisfying to the reader, then that's the didactic call to arms that the book issues at the end. I had several students that were angry or frustrated with the ending, and felt that the book's calling them to do something about their anger and figuring out what to do with that, and which is represented in Donis's comment to her aunt that they need to have one of these parties.
Yeah, and that speaks to I don't have a word for it, quite honestly. So interestingly, the author doesn't call it a rape, right? But that's, at least in my mind, clearly what has happened. Even the word sexual assault removes some of the horror of what has existed. And I felt like in that moment, I had a person say to me, well, it wasn't like Donis even addressed that issue. And I thought, oh, you have the good fortune of never having experienced something like that, right? That because when Donis puts herself in a different place, that is her way of surviving that, right? And then ultimately, like Sean, you were talking about the recourse thing. So where am I going with this? That's another area I was doing a little bit of research in. And the sheer number of Native women who are assaulted, which I think is quite honestly almost like a euphemism for it's too gentle of a term for rape as an action, as a means of power and degradation. So some of the contemporary research is talking about the lack of resources that reservations have to address this issue, that because of different treaties between our government and the Indian governments and the inability to work through that in a way that can honestly even bring any sense of justice. And so like you were saying with the blanket party, it becomes this way of an individual taking their own steps toward recourse or justice and never honestly getting fully there, because you can't have that part of yourself back, but to take those steps forward when governments can't and won't, and you've been devalued as a human being. Interestingly, so they said 1 in 3 Native women will be the victims of sexual assault. It's more than 2.5 times the number of any other population, and that the majority take place on reservations, and that the majority are inflicted by white men. And so some of the research looks at this kind of extension of post-colonialism as a means of controlling and inflicting power and degrading another human being. So just because the author doesn't say every detail doesn't mean that it's not there and strongly felt. And some of the blanket party and these other practices can be ways to achieve a sense of justice.
Just went deep. But I love that your students felt that sense of dissatisfaction and took it as a call to themselves to want to think about these things differently and want to use their own voices to affect change. And I think that's possibly the point here, that we are awakened to this and we need to have these conversations that are difficult and try to work together to come up with solutions for these really complicated issues. So having the space to do that is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And having the students feel dissatisfied and wanting to work towards change is incredibly powerful.
See, that's one of 2 responses that I've been noticing. So a good number of students see the healing process or the beginning of the healing process for Donis as reflective of a way that they can think about healing from their own issues and traumas and challenges. So there's a positive way of thinking about the ending where you try to locate your own hurt or fear, anxiety, and a way forward from that. So the students, I've been assigning them a review, right? And so one of the questions when you write a review is who you're writing the review for. And many students are choosing to write them for young audiences who are trying to deal with, challenges of this kind of sort and how the book might offer a way forward. So you see the two different ways of thinking about the ending. Either you're the call to arms ending, where this is happening to other people, therefore I feel responsible and I would like to take some action that would help people who are suffering myself, or you recognize yourself in the story and therefore you see that path forward as a positive, and you feel like, oh, one student said she felt so relieved or so happy with the jingle dance because it felt like she was being recognized and what happened to her, even though she hadn't said it to anybody, but she was reading about that dance and how uplifting it was for Donis, and then had the repercussion for herself. So I think both of those feelings at the end, either you feel the sense of injustice and therefore you want to do something for other people, or you feel, hey, maybe this book offered me a way of thinking about what happened to me in a more positive way.
Yeah, and I think we also place on other cultures our own culture's method of dealing with different traumas and difficulties, right? And so this idea of you have to talk about it or deal with it in a certain way. So when Donis is dreaming and she is dreaming about the pansies being collected, right? And how the one young girl and her grandmother just collected them in silence. And that was part of the healing, right? Like some of us would say, well, how is that? Well, it's healing for those people in that particular culture. And again, thinking about how do we engage in that, even in the research that I was doing, it talked about the importance of not trying to have one pat method that every tribal community would use to address issues such as these. that every tribe has their own way that they need to move forward with it, and that we have to be respectful of that particular tribe's way. And I know that the Michigan Humanities Council, in the literature that they gave all of us, right, as a means of working into and with the book with our students, they talked about the importance of not approaching the Native American culture as though it's this one monolith, right, that all are the same, that it's enormously important to acknowledge differences that exist in different tribes and their specific way of handling traumas as well as celebrations. Well, the Edwards, that's enormously frustrating, right? So it goes back to Sean's point about frustrating. I mean, you would acknowledge this, Patty, and it is a frustrating ending. Like you want them to pay.
Yeah.
And yet that's also a reflection of reality in life. And so it's as much about each person's way of figuring out how to deal with that and move on as it is. I mean, definitely as a society, we need to treat this differently. But it is a reflection of life. And so that's something that I actually appreciated about the book. One of my students came up to me at the end of class, because in my courses, they're reading the book at a slower pace. They're a little bit frustrated because they're like, we're done with the book in Comp 2, Jennifer. And we're, maybe halfway through it. But one of my students came up to me and she said, well, what did you think about the ending with Jamie and Donis? Maybe I'll lead us down this path now, right? And I said, well, I wasn't totally dissatisfied with it. I said, I honestly, is there part of me that you always wish for this kind of idyllic, happy ending, walking off into the sunset? But I really appreciated the way that I felt Donis came into her own, and that she said, you have to go and become a whole person. And I need to do this as well before we can even entertain the idea of being a couple together. And I thought that was beautiful and empowering and brave. And it also, at some point in that end piece, went back to, I believe it was Granny June, who said, things end the way they begin. Yeah. And so it was especially important to Donis there too, because so much of that began in lies, necessary lies and deception for Jamie, right, being a undercover agent, but that there needed to be that break from that, presenting identity. I mean, that's what we call it in my class. Yeah.
And I think while the ending wasn't necessarily like the satisfying fairy tale, it was true.
Yeah.
It's a true to life ending. Like, things aren't always neat and tidy. And that's how I felt about this whole book. Like, Donis felt so real to me. She was such a vivid character.
Yeah.
That the whole reading of it, she was a real person to me. And this ending feels very authentic and real to Donis.
And I felt like that stayed in alignment with who she was as a hockey player as well, right? Like she is a strong, independent female that doesn't need to define herself only through the eyes of a relationship with a man in a very traditional notion. And so that remained true to who Donis is and the way that she was able to fight for that sense of self, and also really strongly encourage that of another human being. And that's oddly what I also thought. I mean, the author could totally disagree with me on this, but I felt like she was doing that with her mom too, more in the end, by telling her about these surgeries and the other things that she had been sheltering her mother from.
I don't remember if this conversation was part of a recent podcast. Patty, you might, but it might be just something that we talked about in class. But the point about Jamie needing to go forth and realize himself before he can meaningfully participate in a relationship. He feels like he's ready at the end. He tells her that he is, but she knows that he isn't. So she sends him forth to find himself. The point is part of it is that the Jamie character enables the reader to participate in the book in a meaningful way. If the reader doesn't know a lot about Native American culture in particular, or Ojibwa culture in particular, because through the Jamie character, we learn things because he's ignorant ignorant, and so he asks questions, and so he stands in for the reader. And if Jamie's being told, right, to go forth and find himself, then that also means that the reader, who is learning things and discovering things, and then has to go figure out who he or she himself or herself are, that's us being sent forth in that way. We've had our opportunity to have a relationship with Donis, but we aren't fully ready for that yet. So therefore, we need to go forth and figure out who we are.
I also thought there was kind of a full circle moment, that it was kind of more therapeutic in the way that it ended, because this is what Lily was trying to do with Travis and was not able to be successful. She was saying, you need to go and figure yourself out, and we need to grow in this separate way before we can come back together. And so Donis was able to demonstrate doing that successfully in this instance. Which,
yeah, that's another great example of that I'd forgotten about. But yeah, she was insistent upon that.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. So I thought maybe I went way too dark, too deep, too fast. But then that is what this end section is about, right?
Yeah.
And when we think about Kiwanin and North, and when she translates that for us in the beginning, it's this time for resting and reflecting in the place of dreams, stories, and truth. And truth, right? And the author says in her author's note, and man, I just think this is, I almost swore there. It's beautiful. I think it's beautiful where she said, there's an important distinction between writing about trauma and writing a tragedy. I sought to write about identity, loss, and injustice, and also of love, joy, connection, friendship, hope, laughter, and beauty and strength in my Ojibwe community. And it's paramount to share and celebrate what justice and healing looks like in a tribal community, the cultural events. That is gorgeous. And to me, that brings everything back, right?
That you don't just have the single story of Indigenous people suffering or being
incapable of carving their own future.
Right. Or having lived through so much trauma, that it's both. There is trauma, but there also is joy and success. You're crafting a more complex, full picture.
Yeah, I had a student come up with a good microcosm of that, because there's the speech that Donis gives. It's not in our section. It's in an earlier section where she's complaining to the FBI or taking them to task because they are only looking at the crime and the darkness and the problems in the community, and not how the community comes together and shares and survives. And the character, the Dana Firekeeper character, who otherwise is fairly awful in various choices that she makes in the story, also raised Stormy Nardine to be part of her family because he couldn't experience a family otherwise. And so, you know, even the characters who are flawed, which they all are, and there's a comment about that at the end, participate meaningfully in lovely things. And that's fascinating and pretty powerful, especially at the end.
Right. So I was thinking about that, Sean. I'm glad that you brought that up, because Dana's character is enormously frustrating, right? Like, how could she do this, especially when she's in this point of power? But there's an earlier section with Lily's mom, where I think it's Granny June is talking about when all of the girls were brought off to the boarding school, right? And they were beaten and abused and their culture stripped away from them. And Granny June, you know, chides Lily and Donis for their negative comments about Lily's mother, and says, until you know that and appreciate that, which in interpersonal communication, we talk about that as the environment, the fields of experience. Until you understand that, don't judge that other person. And so the author does a wonderful job of doing that with Dana Firekeeper throughout, right? She talks about Firekeeper waking up with snow on her in the winter, right? Or it was particles of snow on her. And that's why she kept the house so incredibly warm, right? This tropical heat is because she didn't want to have that experience. And she raises Stormy when his own parents are, you know, in and out of different difficulties. And so it helps us to appreciate that a person, just like there isn't a single story of a community, of a culture, that there isn't a single story of a person either, that there are many experiences that make them the individual that they are and lead them to different choices.
I thought it was super interesting the way Boulley chose to represent Dana at the end of this book, that she said some people thought that she was let off too easy, and some people thought that it was a powerful woman getting torn down. And I think that that was a very intentional choice that she made to represent those two different viewpoints and let people know the challenges that a woman would face in that position. And though we may completely disagree with the choices that she made, to kind of see her as a more full character.
You know who I was glad came back at the end? And so one of the two characters that I was interested in from the very beginning of the book, and I was sad that they disappeared for such a long time. And it was interesting that they did, were the nieces. The younger girls, and it intrigued me because they became merely symbolic of the reason why Adonis was so interested in contributing to her community and trying to solve the crisis. Yes. Because these girls were her pole star, that what was going to happen to them down the road was important to her, and I didn't want them to merely become symbols. So I was so glad that they came back at the end, and they were so fierce and so interested in their language, and that they'd clearly been told stories and had learned from the stories, and it was good for me to hear from them again and see them again. So I was glad they showed up again at the end.
And listeners, you must read book number 2, because Perry is the main, she is the protagonist, and Adonis makes another few appearances. I won't say anything more than that, don't worry.
I've been waiting to finish this podcast.
I have students in class who've read the sequel too, and they're also like biting their lips. Many of them, it's like almost to a person, they think that the second book is even more successful than Firekeeper's Daughter.
Yes.
I've heard so many good things. Now that I'm wrapping this up, I can't wait to start it. What final thoughts do we have about working with students on this book? I had a great experience with my student worker. She said, I'm not used to enjoying books for school this much.
So I am going to be honest and say, I have not been doing a fantastic job of teaching this book in my class. I get so caught up in my content that I oftentimes forget about a myriad of other things that I want to bring up. And so I wouldn't blame my students if they felt dissatisfied with not discussing the book more. But this is what I will say that was so enormously powerful in my experience, and I think speaks to the importance of agency and voice, is that one of my students said, Jennifer, this is the first time I've seen myself represented in a book. And most of us, in fact, all of us in this podcast are pretty fortunate, right, that we've seen ourselves represented in books time and time again. And to have a student talk about, I see myself, and that gives it some importance and weight in my life, means something in some way. Gosh, I don't know what more of a compliment an author could receive, quite honestly.
Yeah, I think she's going to get stoked when we talk about things like that, for sure. The way that's represented in the text, and this is a teaser that she does to us early on. So way back, many chapters ago, before we get to the ending, there's the moment where Adonis is frustrated with the Firekeeper's daughter story, the actual story that's the title story, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, in that story, the character isn't named. She commits herself to the power of oral tradition, is that it can be evolved over time, and that they reshape that story so that the character does have a name. But at that moment, she also teases us, because she tells us that in her prayers, she is going to continually now from henceforward omit the Firekeeper name, but only use her spirit name, and she doesn't tell us what that is. But she does tell us on the last page of the book, right? So one of the powerful things of the story is that she's so intimate with us. She tells the reader things she doesn't tell her mom, she doesn't tell Lily, she talks to us, right? And she then, at the end of the book, she even tells us that. She tells us this name that's her personal connection to her creator. So a student saying that I'm using this book or finding this book as inspiration to, name my own role in my own story, like that makes sense, because that's a thing that the main character goes through and does for us.
Mm-hmm.
Any closing thoughts from you, Sean?
Well, I think that
Yeah.
the choice was fantastic. Sometimes I worry about texts like this, and because it's so complicated and there's so many layers that if you're trying to read it as a detective fiction, you can't, because there's just too much else going on, and that kind of thing, and that the book would escape us or get from under our grasp. But I think the actual thing that happened was it has so many different layers to it that so many different students can find a different way in. There are students that didn't like it, and I think that was useful to have their conversation in class. And I do have some students who are reviewing it poorly, but that's just part of the story, right? That's part of the delight of literature. The power of it is that it creates the conversations that we want to have, regardless of what we feel about the characters or the way that they're treated in the stories. So I think it worked fantastically well, and I'm really interested to see what the students say to Angeline Boulley when she comes. Like, what questions do they ask her when she shows up?
Yeah, and I hope that it is the beginning of students on whether it's a personal journey and learning more about their culture, or other people learning about this particular tribe and culture, and then starting to see and hopefully better understand what we call the other, right? We are at this point in our nation where we're not listening to one another, and we have to start being able to sit down at the table and talk to each other. And I think this book in different ways helps us to do that, because it is the beginning of a journey, and it's complicated and messy, and it doesn't turn out the way that all want it to, and that's part of the point.
I think that's what makes it such a powerful
Mhm.
common read. And I'm so excited that so many people have jumped on board this semester and participated along with us. It has been just such an honor and a true joy for me, because I've really enjoyed participating in the dialogue around this book. It will be hard to top, I think. It's been really special as an experience for me. So
Mhm.
I look forward to future common reads, but I think this one will always really be a special one in my book.
I agree.
Yeah,
Okay.
so read the sequel. Everybody read that. But then
Yeah.
next semester we have another intense family story with Fun Home, and people should stay tuned and start paying attention to what we might do with that book in the winter.
Okay, stay tuned. That is all for now. I'm Patty Skinner.
I'm Jennifer Lundberg-Anders.
And Sean Henning.
Thank you so much for joining me. Can we also talk about Mike Edwards swimming to Canada and playing Swiss hockey? What a jerk.
Sweden, I think he went to, or there's a rumor. We don't know
No,
what happened to
where do
him.
we
That's
go
part
from
of-
here?
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm leading us down this path.